The year was 1929, and the stock market had just crashed, sending America spiraling into what would become known as the Great Depression. In kitchens across the country, families faced empty pantries and empty pockets. But our grandparents were a resourceful generation. They didn't just survive. They created meals from whatever they could find, stretching ingredients to their limits and wasting nothing. Today, we're going to journey back to those challenging times and explore 100 humble meals that kept our grandparents going when times were tough. These aren't fancy recipes with exotic ingredients. These are the forgotten dishes born from necessity and ingenuity. Poor man's meal. When pennies were stretched to breaking point, the poor man's meal became a staple in countless homes across America. This simple yet filling dish consisted of potatoes, onions, and hot dogs, affordable ingredients that could feed an entire family. My grandmother Martha would tell stories of her mother peeling potatoes after a long day of work, carefully cubing them so nothing went to waste. The sizzle of those potatoes hitting the hot pan, dancing with diced onions until they turned golden brown. It was the soundtrack of dinner time during those lean years. When the potatoes were almost done, sliced hot dogs would join the mix, adding protein and flavor to the humble meal. What made this dish special wasn't just its affordability, but how it brought families together around the table. In those uncertain times, the comfort of a warm, filling meal provided more than just nutrition. It offered hope that tomorrow might be a little better. Dandelion salad. Imagine walking through your neighborhood in the 1930s and seeing folks hunched over in their yards, not weeding, but harvesting dinner. Dandelion greens, those pesky plants most people today try to eliminate from their lawns, were once collected and transformed into nutritious salads during the Depression. These bitter greens would be carefully washed to remove any grit. Then, dressed simply with a splash of vinegar, a drizzle of oil, if available, and a sprinkle of salt. Sometimes a hard-boiled egg might be added for extra protein if the family was fortunate enough to keep chickens. The result was a vitamin-rich dish that cost absolutely nothing except the effort to gather it. My great-aunt Josephine once told me that her mother could spot the tenderest dandelion leaves from 20 paces, a skill born from necessity when the grocery shelves were empty but the yards were full of free food just waiting to be harvested. Bread and milk. Sometimes the simplest meals leave the deepest memories. For many children of the Depression, a bowl of bread soaked in warm milk, perhaps with a sprinkle of sugar if it was available, was both breakfast and comfort food wrapped into one humble dish. Day-old bread, sometimes several days old, would find new life in this warm, soft creation. Nothing went to waste in those difficult years. The bread would soak up the milk, creating a texture similar to today's bread. Pudding, but much simpler. My grandfather used to reminisce about how his mother would warm the milk on the stove during winter mornings, making the house smell inviting despite the sparse ingredients. It filled our bellies when there wasn't much else, he'd say. And somehow, she made us feel rich even when our cupboards were nearly bare. Even decades later, when prosperity had returned, many from that generation would still make this simple dish, perhaps adding cinnamon or a touch of honey, a reminder of how they'd made it through the toughest of times. Hoover stew, named with bitter irony after President Herbert Hoover, who held office when the Depression began. Hoover stew became synonymous with soup kitchens and struggling families trying to stretch ingredients to feed as many mouths as possible. This one-pot wonder combined macaroni noodles with canned goods, typically stewed tomatoes and whatever vegetables were available. Sliced hot dogs often made an appearance, providing protein when meat was a luxury. The genius of Hoover's stew was its adaptability. Families could throw in whatever they had on hand, and the result was always a filling meal that could feed many. I remember my grandmother telling me how her mother would thin the stew with water when unexpected guests arrived, somehow making it stretch just a little further. "No one ever left our table hungry," she'd say with pride, "even when we hardly had anything to give." Water pie. It sounds impossible, a pie made primarily of water, but this Depression-era dessert proves just how creative people can be when traditional ingredients are scarce. With butter, sugar, flour, and water as the main ingredients, families created a simple custard-like pie that offered a sweet treat during bitter times. The magic happens during baking, when the few ingredients transform into something greater than their humble parts. Water pie develops a buttery, sweet filling with a texture similar to caramel custard. Despite having no eggs or milk, it somehow satisfied the craving for dessert when fruit pies and cakes were out of reach for most households. My great-grandmother's recipe card for water pie is stained and worn from use, a testament to how often this something-from-nothing dessert graced her table during the 1930s. When I make it today, I'm reminded that ingenuity in the kitchen isn't new. It's a tradition passed down from those who had no choice but to create meals from whatever they had. Creamed chipped beef on toast, known affectionately, or not so affectionately, as SOS in military circles, creamed chipped beef on toast became a household staple during the Depression. Thin slices of dried beef in a creamy white sauce served over toast created a meal that was both economical and filling. The dried beef had a long shelf life, crucial in times before widespread refrigeration, and a little went a long way in flavoring the sauce. A basic roux of flour and butter, thinned with milk, created the creamy base that transformed a small amount of meat into a meal that could feed a family. Served over toast, it became a complete dinner that warmed both body and spirit. My Uncle Frank, who grew up during those lean years, once told me that his mother's version of this dish was what he requested for his birthday dinner every year, even after better times had returned. Something about that warm, savory gravy over toast just tasted like home, he said, no matter how simple the ingredients. Cornmeal mush. Before fancy breakfast cereals lined grocery shelves, cornmeal mush was the morning meal that started many a day during the Depression. Simple to make with just cornmeal, water, and salt, it could be served soft and warm, like porridge, or left to cool, sliced and fried for dinner. When served warm, a drizzle of molasses or a sprinkle of sugar made it feel like a treat. The leftover mush, once cooled and solidified, would transform into something entirely different when sliced and fried until golden and crispy. Paired with beans or topped with syrup, it became a versatile staple that could appear at any meal of the day. Ethel, my neighbor who recently turned 95, recalls her mother making a pot of mush that would last for days, changing form with each meal. Monday morning it was breakfast porridge, she told me. By Tuesday dinner, it was crispy fried slices that tasted nothing like leftovers. My mother was a magician with cornmeal. She had to be. Potato soup, when meat was scarce, and vegetables. Seasonal, potato soup became the reliable go-to that could fill hungry stomachs year-round. Potatoes, onions, and water formed the base, with milk added if available for richness. The humble potato, affordable, filling, and with a long storage life, became the hero ingredient of countless Depression-era meals. My grandfather described his mother's potato soup as something made from almost nothing that tasted like everything. She would save potato peels from other meals, simmering them to extract every bit of flavor before adding diced potatoes and onions. A pat of butter, if they were lucky, would create a golden circle floating on top of each bowl, a small luxury in difficult times. The soup would often appear on their table twice weekly, never exactly the same as different seasonings and additions. Would transform it. Sometimes a handful of foraged greens, other times a sprinkle of bacon saved from Sunday's breakfast. Each variation taught the valuable lesson that creativity in cooking could elevate even the simplest ingredients. Bologna. Gravy. When meat was a luxury, resourceful cooks found ways to stretch even the most humble ingredients. Bologna gravy took an inexpensive processed meat and transformed it into a savory sauce that could be ladled over potatoes, rice, or biscuits to create a filling meal. Diced bologna fried until crisp provided the foundation, with flour sprinkled in to create a roux. Water or milk would transform it into a thick, savory gravy studded with bits of meat. The smoky flavor of the bologna permeated the sauce, creating the illusion of a more substantial meat dish at a fraction of the cost. My friend's grandmother, who raised 6 children during the Depression, kept her bologna gravy recipe written on an index card until well into her 90s. "It saved us more times than I can count," she would say, "and the children never knew we were down to our last dime when I served it." Vinegar pie. Another desperation dessert that emerged during hard times, vinegar pie might sound unappealing to modern ears, but it cleverly mimicked the tanginess of citrus when lemons and other fruits were unavailable or too expensive. Using vinegar, usually apple cider vinegar, to provide acidity and tartness, combined with sugar, water, flour, and spices like cinnamon or nutmeg, this pie filled the role of fruit pies when orchards seemed a world away. The vinegar flavor mellowed during baking, leaving just enough tanginess to balance the sweetness. I discovered my great-grandmother's recipe for vinegar pie tucked into her Bible, a testament to how precious even the simplest recipes were, when options were limited. The note in the margin reads, "Makes a fine dessert when the cupboard is bare," a reminder of how resourcefulness turned necessity into something that could still bring joy to the table. Egg drop soup. When protein was scarce but a family kept a few chickens, egg drop soup became a nourishing meal that made the most of every egg. A simple broth, often just water flavored with salt, pepper, and perhaps some dried herbs, would be brought to a simmer before beaten eggs were slowly drizzled in, creating delicate ribbons throughout the soup. This technique, borrowed from Chinese cuisine but adapted for American kitchens during the Depression, transformed a single egg into a meal that could serve several people. Sometimes enhanced with a handful of rice or small pasta, it provided warmth and nourishment when little else was available. My neighbor, Mrs. Chen, whose parents lived through the Depression, tells me that her American-born mother and Chinese-born father discovered they both knew versions of this soup from their respective childhoods, a reminder that resourcefulness in hard times crosses cultural boundaries. Bean sandwiches. When meat for sandwiches was unaffordable, many families turned to beans as a protein-rich alternative. Mashed beans, often navy beans or pintos, would be seasoned with whatever was available: onions, salt, pepper, maybe a dash of vinegar, and spread between slices of bread to create a filling lunch. These sandwiches traveled well in lunch. Pails to factories, fields, and schoolrooms, providing sustained energy through long workdays. What began as a necessity became such a staple that many continued making bean sandwiches long after economic recovery, appreciating their simplicity and healthfulness. My father requested bean sandwiches in his lunch until the day he retired. My friend's mother once told me. He said they reminded him of his mother's love, how she made sure he never went hungry, even in the worst years. Potato pancakes. Another ingenious use for the affordable potato, potato pancakes transformed this humble tuber into a crispy, satisfying meal. Grated potatoes mixed with a small amount of flour, an egg if available, and seasoning would be formed into patties and fried. Until golden and crisp, these pancakes made use of leftover cooked potatoes or fresh ones depending on what was available. The outside would become crispy while the inside remained tender and soft. Topped with applesauce or sour cream in more prosperous households, or simply served plain in leaner times, they became a beloved dish across many American communities. Friend Rosa's grandmother, who emigrated from Poland just before the Depression hit, said potato pancakes were the bridge between her old country and new home. "In Poland, we made them for celebrations," she said. "In America, during the Depression, we made them to survive. Now I make them to remember both times." Mock apple pie. Perhaps one of the most creative culinary allusions to emerge from the Depression, mock apple pie contained no apples at all. Instead, Ritz crackers were the star ingredient, soaked in a syrupy mixture of water, sugar, cream, of tartar, and lemon juice if available. When baked in a pie crust, the crackers took on a texture and flavor remarkably similar to cooked apples. The chemistry behind this miracle is fascinating. The cream of tartar and lemon added tartness, while the crackers softened to a texture reminiscent of fruit. Spiced with cinnamon and nutmeg, the resemblance to real apple pie was close enough to provide comfort when orchards were out of reach. "We knew it wasn't real apple pie," my grandfather once told me, "but it was close enough to remind us of better times, and sometimes that taste of hope was as important as the food itself." Ketchup sandwiches. In the starkest of times, even condiments became main ingredients. The ketchup sandwich, simply ketchup spread between two slices of bread, became emblematic of the deepest struggles during the Depression. Sometimes enhanced with a slice of onion or a sprinkle of sugar, this sandwich represented making do with truly whatever was available. While it might sound unappetizing today, ketchup provided flavor, a hint of vegetable nutrition from tomatoes, and most importantly, filled empty stomachs when other options were exhausted. For many children of the era, these sandwiches were packed for school lunches, a reminder of how desperate times called for extreme creativity. My elderly neighbor, Mr. Wilson, confessed that he couldn't look at ketchup without remembering those difficult years. "We'd make those sandwiches last," he said quietly, "take tiny bites, pretend it was something grand. You learn to be grateful for small mercies when that's all there is." Potato coffee. When real coffee became a luxury few could afford, creative substitutes emerged. Potato coffee, made by cutting potatoes into small cubes, drying them thoroughly, and then roasting them until dark brown before grinding, became one such alternative. Brewed like regular coffee, it provided a hot, dark beverage that helped ease the absence of the real thing. Other coffee substitutes included roasted dandelion roots, chicory, and various grains, but potato coffee was accessible to most since potatoes were among the most affordable foods. While it didn't replicate the caffeine of true coffee, it provided the comfort of a hot morning ritual when so many other comforts were out of reach. My grandmother kept making potato coffee once. A week even after they could afford real coffee again, my barber told me while trimming my hair. She said it reminded her never to take small luxuries for granted. I tried it once. It's not coffee, but there's wisdom in remembering harder times. Milcorno. Developed by home economists working with the Federal Emergency Relief Administration. Milcorno was a protein-rich food made from a mixture of cornmeal, powdered skim milk, and salt. This government-created recipe was distributed to households receiving assistance, providing an economical source of nutrition during the hardest years. Milcorno could be prepared as a porridge, shaped into loaves similar to polenta, or used as an extender in meat dishes when small amounts of ground meat were available. It provided crucial protein and calcium at a time when milk and meat were often out of reach for struggling families. The legacy of Milcorno lives on in emergency food programs today, though most Americans have forgotten this once widespread staple. My research into Depression-era foods led me to an elderly woman who remembered her mother preparing it. "It wasn't delicious," she admitted, "but it filled our stomachs, and for that, we were thankful." Cabbage and noodles. Simple, filling, and economical cabbage and noodles, sometimes called haluski in Eastern European communities, combined two inexpensive ingredients into a satisfying meal. Cabbage, which kept well and provided crucial vitamins, was sliced and fried with onions until tender before being tossed with cooked noodles. A bit of butter or bacon grease, if available, added richness, but even the most basic version provided comfort and sustenance. Cabbage was one of the more affordable fresh vegetables year-round, making this dish accessible even on the tightest budgets. Its versatility meant it could be a side dish or main course, depending on what else was available. My friend Helen remembers her Ukrainian grandmother making this dish throughout her childhood. She'd survived both the Depression and food shortages in Europe, Helen told me. She could make cabbage and noodles taste like a feast just by cooking with love. She'd say, "Simple food, prepared with care, nourishes both body and soul." Wacky cake, depression cake, also known as depression cake. Wacky cake earned its name because it broke all the rules of traditional baking. It contained no eggs, no butter, and no milk, ingredients that were often rationed or too expensive during hard times. Instead, the chemical reaction between vinegar and baking soda created the leavening typically provided by eggs. Made in a single pan with cocoa powder, flour, sugar, oil, vinegar, vanilla, and water, this cake became a birthday staple when families wanted to celebrate despite financial constraints. The cake mixed directly in its baking pan, saving on cleanup and ensuring every precious crumb could be consumed. "My mother made this for every birthday during the Depression," said Mrs. Rodriguez, whom I interviewed for this project. "She'd save sugar rations for weeks sometimes. I still make it for my grandchildren, not because I have to, but because Some recipes deserve to be remembered for the hope they represented. Peanut butter and mayonnaise sandwiches. It might sound like an unusual combination to modern palates, but peanut butter and mayonnaise sandwiches were a common lunch during the Depression. The mayonnaise added moisture and fat to the sometimes dry peanut butter, creating a more filling sandwich that provided protein and energy. Some variations included adding pickle relish, sliced banana, or grated carrots between the slices of bread, depending on what was available. The combination of ingredients created a sandwich that was more satisfying than any single ingredient alone could provide, an important consideration when lunch needed to fuel long hours of work. My mother recalls her father eating these sandwiches. Well into the 1970s, a habit formed during his youth. Dad said the mayonnaise made the peanut butter stretch further. She explained, old habits die hard, especially when they're connected to survival. Hoover blankets, newspaper blankets. While not a food, Hoover blankets became a harsh symbol of the Depression's impact. Newspapers stuffed between threadbare blankets or worn as an extra layer under clothing provided warmth when proper blankets couldn't be afforded. Like Hoover's stew, the name was a bitter reference to President Herbert Hoover, whom many blamed for the economic collapse. This resourceful use of newspapers reminds us that the Depression affected every aspect of daily life, not just meals. Families gathered around dinner tables covered with newspaper blankets at night, eating simple meals like those described here, finding ways to keep body and soul together through the darkest economic times America has known. My grandmother never threw away a newspaper until the 1980s, my colleague David told me. She'd say, "You never know when you might need the warmth of yesterday's news." It wasn't until I researched the Depression that I understood what she meant. Mulligan stew. Born in hobo camps and adopted by struggling families, Mulligan stew represented the ultimate in community-based survival cooking. Named after a fictional Irish character, the stew had no fixed recipe. It consisted of whatever ingredients each participant could contribute to the communal pot. In hobo jungles, men would gather with their found or donated ingredients, a potato here, a carrot there, perhaps a bone with a bit of meat still clinging to it, and create a stew that would feed everyone present. When this concept transferred to home kitchens, it became a way for neighbors to pool resources when individually no one had enough to make a complete meal. It wasn't just food, explained historian James Morton, whose father rode the rails during the Depression. It was community. It was the understanding that sharing what little you had meant, everyone survived. That lesson that we're all in. This together may be the most valuable recipe to emerge from those difficult years. Sugar sandwiches. For children with empty lunch boxes, sugar sandwiches provided a simple solution that required just 3 ingredients: bread, butter, or margarine if available, and sugar. A thin spread of butter topped with a sprinkle of sugar created a sweet treat that provided quick energy and the illusion of dessert during times when actual sweets were rare luxuries. These sandwiches became synonymous with childhood during the Depression, a simple pleasure that parents could provide even in the leanest times. The combination of carbohydrates and sugar offered energy for growing bodies and active minds, even if it lacked the nutritional completeness we value today. My father told me they felt rich when they had sugar sandwiches, my aunt once shared. It wasn't just the sweetness, it was that their parents had managed to give them something special despite everything. That made even plain white bread and a sprinkle of sugar taste like love, shit on a shingle. SOS, this colorfully named dish, usually abbreviated to SOS in polite company, became a staple in both military mess halls and civilian kitchens during the Depression. While the military version typically used chipped beef, home versions often substituted cheaper ground beef or bologna in a white sauce served over toast. The dish earned its nickname from soldiers unimpressed with its appearance, but it provided crucial protein and calories in an economical format. The creamy sauce, made from flour, fat, and milk, stretched a small amount of meat to feed many mouths, while the toast base added filling carbohydrates. My grandfather, a W2 veteran, developed a taste for SOS during his service and requested it regularly after returning home. It wasn't the flavor he loved, my grandmother confided, but the memories of camaraderie around the mess hall tables. Food becomes something more when it's shared during difficult times. Dandelion wine. When times were too tough for store-bought. Luxuries, homemade dandelion wine provided a rare indulgence. Harvested dandelion blossoms were steeped with sugar, citrus, and yeast to create a sweet golden wine that helped make special occasions feel special despite economic hardships. This homebrewing served multiple purposes. It transformed free backyard weeds into something valuable, provided a modest celebration option for weddings and holidays, and sometimes became a source of additional income when sold discreetly to neighbors, particularly during Prohibition, which overlapped with the early Depression years. Mr. Jenkins, a 93-year-old I interviewed, recalled his parents making dandelion wine every spring. Mother would send us children out with baskets to collect the brightest yellow blossoms, he said. Father would say, even in the hardest times we must remember to celebrate being alive. That wine was liquid sunshine in dark years. Hot water cornbread. With fewer ingredients than traditional cornbread, hot water cornbread became a quick, economical side dish that accompanied many Depression-era meals. Simply mixing cornmeal with hot water, salt, and perhaps a touch of bacon grease created a dough that could be shaped into patties and fried crisp. The resulting bread had a crispy exterior and soft interior, perfect for sopping up the juices of beans, greens, or thin soups. It required no milk, eggs, or even baking powder, ingredients that might not be available, making it accessible even to the poorest households. Grandma could make hot water cornbread with her eyes closed. My cousin Elaine remembers, she'd be talking, not measuring a thing, and somehow those crispy golden discs would appear like magic, steaming on the plate. She fed 8 children through the Depression without ever letting them go hungry, and this cornbread was often how she did it, cheese rarebit. When a small amount of cheese needed to stretch to feed many, Welsh rarebit, or rabbit as it was often mispronounced, became a go-to meal. This savory sauce, made by melting cheese into a simple roux with beer or milk, created a rich topping for toast that transformed a modest amount of cheese into a satisfying meal. Depression-era cooks adapted traditional Welsh rarebit recipes to use whatever cheese was available, often the cheapest options or small ends from various pieces combined together. The resulting dish felt more special than plain cheese sandwiches while using the same basic ingredients more economically. My grandmother would save cheese rinds in the icebox for weeks, said Mrs. Thompson, who shared her family recipes with me. When she had enough, she'd make rarebit, and we thought it was a feast. She'd serve it with such ceremony that we never realized it was born of saving scraps. Onion sandwich. The humble onion sandwich, simply sliced onions between bread with a sprinkle of salt, represented food at its most basic during the hardest years. Raw onions provided flavor, crunch, and nutrients when little else was affordable. Some variations included a smear of lard or butter if available, or a sprinkle of pepper for additional seasoning. Onions were among the most affordable vegetables year-round, storing well through winter months when fresh produce was scarce. Their strong flavor made even the plainest bread seem more substantial, providing satisfaction when true fullness wasn't possible. My research led me to a journal kept by a Chicago schoolteacher during the Depression, who wrote, "Many of my students bring only onion sandwiches for lunch day after day. I've begun keeping apples on my desk, casually offering them as if I simply have too many, preserving the dignity of children who have too little." Prune pudding. Prunes, economical, shelf-stable, and nutritious, became a Depression-era staple, particularly in desserts like prune pudding. This simple pudding combined stewed prunes with thickened sweetened milk or water, creating a dessert that provided both sweetness and valuable nutrients when fresh fruit was unavailable. Even the White House embraced this frugal dessert, with Eleanor Roosevelt famously serving prune pudding to dignitaries as a show of solidarity with struggling Americans. The First Lady's endorsement helped elevate this humble dish and encouraged resourcefulness in kitchens nationwide. Rose Williams, who grew up during the Depression, told me, "Mother would serve prune pudding as if it were the finest dessert in the world, on her best dishes with such pride. It wasn't until I was older that I realized it was because prunes were what she could afford, not what she would have chosen in better times." Loaves, meat stretchers. When small amounts of meat needed to feed many mouths, inventive cooks created loaves, that extended protein with affordable fillers. Beyond traditional meatloaf made with breadcrumbs, Depression-era loaves incorporated oatmeal, cornmeal, grated vegetables, or cooked rice to stretch ground meat further than seemed possible. These meat stretchers became a canvas for creativity, with innovative cooks developing signature recipes based on what was available. A small amount of ground beef mixed with oats, grated onions, and perhaps a single egg could become a meal for a family of 6 when shaped into a loaf and baked. My father claimed he never ate the same meatloaf twice during the entire Depression, chuckled Robert, whose parents raised 6 children during those years. Mother had a gift for making whatever was in the pantry taste intentional rather than desperate. Her rule was meat for flavor, not for filling. The fillers were where her creativity shined. Potato candy. For families craving something sweet. When sugar was rationed and chocolate unaffordable, potato candy provided an ingenious solution. A small amount of mashed potato was mixed with powdered sugar to form a dough, which could be rolled out, spread with peanut butter, and formed into spiraled candy slices that resembled fancy store-bought treats. This Appalachian candy became widespread during the Depression, offering a way to create something special from ordinary ingredients. The potato provided bulk while absorbing the sugar, creating a sweet, fudge-like consistency without requiring butter or cream. Great-grandma's recipe box had this candy written on a scrap of brown paper bag, my friend Lisa told me. The instructions were so simple, but she'd drawn little flowers around the border of the recipe. That tells you how special these small luxuries were during such difficult times. Chow chow, pickle relish. Nothing exemplified the waste not mentality of the Depression better than chow chow, a tangy pickle relish made from end-of-season vegetables that might otherwise go unused. Green tomatoes, cabbage, onions, peppers, and whatever else remained in the garden would be chopped, salted, and preserved in a vinegar brine with spices. This colorful condiment added flavor to plain beans, bread, or potatoes throughout winter months when fresh vegetables were scarce. The preservation technique transformed potential waste into a valuable addition to the pantry that could last for months without refrigeration. Grandmother's chow chow was famous in our community, recalled Pastor Williams during our conversation about Depression-era foods. When winter seemed darkest and meals most monotonous, she'd open a jar, and suddenly plain cornbread became something to look forward to. That bright, tangy flavor was like bottled sunshine during difficult times. Spaghetti with boiled carrots and white sauce. Even the White House practiced economical cooking during the Depression. Eleanor Roosevelt promoted this unusual pasta dish as part of her campaign to help Americans adapt to harder times. Overcooked spaghetti was tossed with boiled carrots and a basic white sauce made from flour, fat, and milk. Though it might not appeal to modern palates accustomed to tomato-based pasta sauces, this dish provided carbohydrates, vegetables, and a small amount of dairy in an economical format. The First Lady's endorsement gave it legitimacy and helped Americans embrace similar adaptations in their own kitchens. My mother-in-law still made this well into the 1970s, shared Doris during our community recipe collection event. She'd say, if it was good enough for Eleanor Roosevelt, it's good enough for us. There was pride in these adaptations. They represented resilience, not deprivation. Fried bologna. When steak was a distant memory, fried bologna became the poor man's steak in many households. This inexpensive processed meat developed a different flavor and texture when fried until the edges curled up, creating a dish that felt more special than cold bologna sandwiches, often served with potatoes, or over rice with gravy. Fried bologna made a humble ingredient seem like a proper meal. Some cooks would score the edges to prevent curling or cut a small hole in the center to ensure even cooking, techniques that transformed this budget meat into something that required skill and attention. Dad would fry bologna with such ceremony, remembered Tom, whose father worked as a janitor during the Depression after losing his accounting job. He'd call it special dinner and serve it as proudly as if it were prime rib. It wasn't until I was older that I understood this was his way of maintaining dignity when providing for his family meant serving the cheapest meat available. Navy bean soup. When meat was scarce, beans became the protein centerpiece of many meals. Navy bean soup, made with small white beans, water, and perhaps a ham bone for flavor if one was available, provided filling nourishment that could simmer all day and feed a family for pennies. The long, slow cooking process transformed hard beans into a creamy soup that felt substantial despite its simple ingredients. A single ham bone might flavor several pots of soup over time, with each batch stretching further as the meat became scarcer and the bone contributed mainly flavor. Bean soup day was Monday in our house, recalled Mrs. Peterson, whose parents both worked in factories during the Depression. Mother would set it to simmer before leaving for work, and it would be ready when we all returned home, tired and hungry. The house would smell so welcoming, proof that you can create comfort even in the hardest times. Corn chowder. Fresh, sweet corn was in season. Families would enjoy it fresh, but they'd also create hearty chowders that could stretch a small amount of corn into a complete meal. Corn chowder combined corn kernels with potatoes, onions, and water, or milk in more fortunate households, creating a thick, satisfying soup. The natural sweetness of corn made this chowder feel special, particularly to children. Even a few ears of corn could flavor a large pot of soup when extended with potatoes, making this an economical way to enjoy seasonal produce and preserve its flavor in a filling meal. My grandfather grew corn behind their tenement building in the city, shared Eleanor, whose family history I recorded. Just a small patch, but when harvest came, nothing went to waste. The fresh ears were for Sunday dinner, and everything else went into chowder that would feed them for days. He'd save the cobs to flavor the broth, then remove them before serving. That kind of resourcefulness wasn't just about survival. It became a kind of family wisdom passed down through generations. Bread pudding. Stale bread transformed into comfort food. That's the magic of bread pudding, a Depression-era favorite that turns what might be wasted into something wonderful. Cubes of dry bread soaked in a mixture of milk, sugar, and perhaps an egg if available, then baked until golden, created a warm dessert from ingredients many households had on hand. Variations included adding raisins, apple pieces, or a sprinkle of cinnamon for special occasions. The beauty of bread pudding was its ability to transform the most humble ingredient, bread past its prime, into something that felt like a treat, proving that resourcefulness could create moments of sweetness even in difficult times. My neighbor, Mrs. Collins, now in her 90s, still makes bread pudding every Sunday. During the Depression, this was our weekly dessert. Mother would save every bread heel and dried piece all week for Sunday's pudding. Now, I make it not because I need to save bread, but because it reminds me of her ingenuity and care. Potato donuts. When flour was scarce or expensive, creative cooks discovered that mashed potatoes could be incorporated into dough, reducing the amount of flour needed while adding moisture and substance. Potato donuts used this trick to create a sweet treat using less expensive ingredients. These donuts stayed moist longer than traditional versions and had a tender texture that made them seem more special than their simple ingredients would suggest. Typically fried and then rolled in sugar, or simply served plain when sugar was too precious, they provided a rare sweet indulgence when store-bought treats were out of reach. Grandma's potato donuts were famous in our neighborhood, recalled John during our community recipe collection. She would make them maybe once a month, and neighborhood children would somehow know. They'd appear at her kitchen door with hopeful faces. She never turned a hungry child away, even when she had barely enough for her own family. Egg gravy. When protein was scarce but a family kept chickens, egg gravy provided a way to transform a single egg into a meal for several people. Made by creating a simple roux with flour and fat, then adding water or milk and a beaten egg, this gravy would be stirred constantly until the egg cooked in threads throughout the mixture. Served over biscuits, toast, or potatoes, egg gravy created a protein-enhanced meal from minimal ingredients. The technique demonstrates the ingenuity of cooks who found ways to extend every precious ingredient to its maximum potential. My mother could feed our family of 5 with 2 eggs and a cup of flour, remembered Virginia, who grew up on a tenant. farm during the Depression. She'd make egg gravy for dinner and tell stories while we ate, making us forget that our plates held little more than gravy and bread. Her gift wasn't just stretching food, it was stretching hope. Salt pork gravy. When fresh meat was unaffordable, many families relied on salt pork, a cheap preserved cut that could add flavor to otherwise plain meals. Salt pork gravy began by rendering the fat from a small piece of salt pork, then using that fat to create a roux with flour before adding water or milk to form a creamy, savory gravy. This gravy, often served over potatoes or biscuits, transformed a humble meal into something that felt substantial and satisfying. The salt pork itself might be diced and included in the gravy or saved for another meal, as even a small amount could flavor several dishes throughout the week. Robert, whose parents farmed during the Depression, shared, "Father would bring home salt pork when he couldn't afford much else. Mother would create meals around that single ingredient for days. Gravy one night, flavoring for beans the next. Nothing was too humble to be transformed by skill and care. Cornmeal pancakes. When wheat flour became too expensive, cornmeal stepped in as an affordable alternative for breakfast pancakes. Mixed with water, a pinch of salt, and perhaps a bit of bacon grease for the griddle, cornmeal pancakes provided a filling breakfast that required minimal ingredients. These pancakes had a distinctive texture and flavor, grittier and more substantial than their wheat flour counterparts. Topped with molasses, syrup, or simply butter if available, they became a breakfast that could fuel long days of hard work, critical during a time when physical labor was often the only employment available. Grandmother called them working man's pancakes, said Thomas, whose grandfather worked on WPA projects during the Depression. She'd rise before dawn to mix the batter, ensuring grandfather had the energy for long days of manual labor. She'd pack extra for him to share with men who had no one at home to cook for them. Community survived because people looked out for each other. Tomato soup cake. When fresh fruits and dairy products were luxuries, creative bakers developed cake recipes using shelf-stable ingredients. Tomato soup cake, using canned condensed tomato soup in place of milk, eggs, and oil, became a surprisingly delicious spice cake that required minimal, expensive ingredients. The acidity of the tomato soup reacted with baking soda to help the cake rise, while the soup's sweetness and subtle flavor worked well with spices like cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg. Most people who tasted it had no idea tomato soup was the secret ingredient. They just knew it was a moist, flavorful cake that seemed to appear even when other desserts were impossible. My aunt swore she would take the secret of her spice. "Cake to her grave," laughed Maria. It wasn't until after she passed that we found the recipe card labeled Depression Cake, tomato soup, tucked in her cookbook. We were shocked. We'd been enjoying it for years with no idea it began as a way to make cake without eggs or butter. Stuffed onions. Large, sweet onions became vessels for stretching small amounts of protein or leftover scraps during the Depression. Hollowed-out onions would be filled with a mixture that might include breadcrumbs, small amounts of ground meat or sausage, herbs, and whatever vegetables were available, then baked until tender. This technique transformed an affordable vegetable into a complete meal, with the onion shells adding flavor to the filling as they baked. The stuffed onions could be scaled up or down depending on what was available, making them adaptable to almost any budget. When I make stuffed onions today, I use expensive wild rice and pine nuts, admitted Chef Morales, who collects historical recipes. But my grandmother's version used stale bread, a spoonful of ground beef, and whatever she could forage from her victory garden. Her resourcefulness inspires my cooking even now, reminding me that creativity in the kitchen began with necessity. Garbage soup. Despite its unappetizing name, garbage soup represented the height of resourcefulness during the Depression. Vegetable peels, meat bones, wilting produce, anything that might otherwise be discarded, went into a pot that simmered on the back of the stove, creating a perpetual broth that could become the base for multiple meals. Families would add to this pot throughout the week, removing portions for dinner and replenishing with new scraps. The result was a flavorful stock that captured every possible nutrient from ingredients before they truly became waste. This practice, born of necessity, exemplifies the waste-not philosophy that defined cooking during hard times. Mother kept her soup pot going all winter, remembered Harold, who grew up during the Depression in Minnesota. Nothing edible ever hit the garbage. It went into that pot first. She'd ladle out bowls of whatever that day's soup had become, and somehow it was always different, always nourishing. That pot fed us through the coldest months when fresh food was just a memory. Potato salad sandwiches, creating filling meals. From affordable ingredients required creativity, and potato salad sandwiches emerged as one solution. Cold potato salad, made with boiled potatoes, a small amount of onion, and minimal mayonnaise, would be spread between slices of bread, creating a sandwich that was more substantial than plain bread but required no expensive meats or cheeses. This sandwich provided carbohydrates for energy and a little protein from the mayonnaise, making it more satisfying than it might appear. For families with access to a garden, additions like radishes or celery might add crunch and flavor when available. My father took potato salad sandwiches to work at the shipyard every day for years, said Elizabeth, whose family lived in Baltimore during the Depression. Mother would make a big batch of potato salad on Sunday, and it would become sandwiches all week. He said the other men envied his lunch. She had a special way with a little mustard and pickle that made it taste like something more than just potatoes. Fried cabbage. Cabbage, affordable, nutritious, and with a long shelf life, became a mealtime staple during the Depression. Fried cabbage, simply sliced cabbage cooked in a small amount of bacon grease or lard until tender and caramelized, transformed this humble vegetable into a flavorful dish that could serve as either side or main course. The slow cooking process brought out the natural sweetness of the cabbage, making it more appealing, particularly to children who might resist vegetables. When paired with cornbread or potatoes, it became a filling meal that provided essential nutrients when fresh produce was limited. Grandmother claimed she could tell a good cook by how they prepared cabbage, shared Reverend Johnson during our community food history project. Anyone can make expensive ingredients taste good, she'd say, but it takes real skill to make a humble head of cabbage into something the family looks forward to eating. Her fried cabbage was proof of that philosophy. Creamed peas on toast. When fresh vegetables were scarce, canned peas provided much-needed nutrition and a touch of green on otherwise beige plates. Creamed peas on toast elevated this simple vegetable by combining it with a basic white sauce made from flour, fat, and milk, then serving the mixture over toast for a complete meal. This dish stretched a small amount of peas to feed several people, while the sauce added richness and the toast provided filling carbohydrates. It represented the kind of complete meal that could be created from minimal, affordable ingredients when necessity demanded creativity. Tuesday was always creamed peas. On toast night, recalled Mrs. Davidson, whose father worked as a railroad engineer during the Depression. Mother ran the household on a strict schedule when money was tight. Each day had its assigned meal that she could prepare on a precise budget. Sunday might have a small piece of meat, but Tuesday was always creamed vegetables on toast. Peas were our favorite. Mayonnaise cake, another miracle cake that required no eggs, milk, or butter. Mayonnaise cake used mayonnaise, which contains eggs and oil, as a substitute for these more expensive ingredients. Mixed with flour, sugar, cocoa powder, and water, the mayonnaise created a surprisingly moist chocolate cake that became a Depression-era favorite. This cake demonstrated the resourcefulness of bakers who understood the science of their ingredients well enough to create substitutions that worked with what was available. The result was a chocolate cake that felt like a luxury during times when luxuries were few and far between. When I told my kids their great-grandmother made chocolate cake with mayonnaise, they were horrified, laughed Susan during our conversation. But when I finally made her recipe for them, they couldn't believe how delicious it was. There's a lesson there about not judging resourcefulness until you've tasted it for yourself. Poor man's steak, hamburger gravy. When actual steak was an impossible dream, creative cooks developed poor man's steak, seasoned ground beef formed into patties, fried, and then simmered in gravy. This technique transformed a small amount of inexpensive ground meat into something that felt more special than simple hamburgers. The gravy, often made using the drippings from the meat combined with flour and water, created additional volume and flavor, making the meal feel more substantial. Served over potatoes, rice, or biscuits, poor man's steak stretched a modest amount of meat to feed an entire family. Father would pronounce it Salisbury steak with exaggerated formality, remembered James with a smile. He'd carve the patties at the table as if they were prime rib, maintaining the dignity of the family meal even when the ingredients were humble. Mother played along, serving it on their wedding china. They taught us that how you honor the meal matters as much as what you're eating. Faux apple pie, green tomato pie. When apples were out of season or too expensive, inventive bakers discovered that green tomatoes, sliced and prepared with sugar, cinnamon, and a touch of lemon juice, created a pie filling remarkably similar to apples in both texture and taste. This apple pie without apples became a fall favorite when gardens produced the last green tomatoes before frost. The secret was in the preparation. Green tomatoes have a firmness and slight tartness that, when properly sweetened and spiced, can mimic the eating experience of apple pie. Many who grew up eating these pies had no idea they weren't getting real apple pie, a testament to the ingenuity of bakers who refused to let seasonality or cost prevent them from creating familiar comforts. My children were grown before I told them that the apple pie they'd loved all their lives contained no apples at all, confided Ruth, whose mother perfected green tomato pie during the Depression. Some traditions born from hard times are worth preserving, not because we need to substitute anymore, but because they connect us to the creativity and resilience of those who came before us. To be continued with more ingenious meals that sustained our grandparents through the toughest of times. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more journeys into our culinary past. Hot milk cake. When butter was scarce but a family kept a cow or had access to milk, hot milk cake provided a simple yet satisfying dessert. Made by heating milk with a small amount of butter, or without it entirely, then mixing it with sugar, flour, and eggs, this cake had a unique texture and delicate flavor that belied its simple ingredients. The heated milk created a different chemical reaction with the flour than cold milk would, resulting in a fine-grained, moist cake that didn't require frosting to be enjoyed. Often served plain or with a dusting of powdered sugar if available, it represented a sweet comfort that could be achieved even with limited resources. Grandmother would make hot milk cake for every birthday, recalled William, a retired teacher, whose family farmed during the Depression. She'd stick a candle in it, just one, to be saved and reused each time. It wasn't about the candle or even the cake, really, but about maintaining celebrations and marking special days even when times were lean. Biscuits and gravy. Perhaps no meal represents Depression-era resourcefulness better than biscuits and gravy. Flour, lard, and milk created tender biscuits, while a gravy made from meat drippings, or simply flour browned in fat, stretched minimal ingredients into a filling breakfast that could fuel a day of hard labor. When meat was available, small pieces of sausage or ham might flavor the gravy, but many families made sawmill gravy with no meat at all, just flour browned in bacon grease or lard, with milk or water added to create a creamy sauce. This humble meal became such a tradition that it remains a beloved comfort food throughout America today. My grandfather insisted on biscuits and gravy every Sunday morning until the day he died at 94, shared Pastor Williams. He'd say, "When you've known true hunger, you never forget the meals that saved you." For his generation, this simple combination of flour, fat, and milk wasn't just food, it was survival made delicious. Potato soup with rivels. Stretching ingredients often meant adding simple dumplings to soups and stews. Rivels, tiny dumplings made from flour, salt, and just enough water to form a crumbly dough, became popular additions to potato soup, adding texture and substance to an already economical dish. The rivels would be dropped by pinches into simmering soup, where they cooked into tender, small dumplings throughout the broth. This technique added filling carbohydrates to the meal, making a pot of soup more satisfying without requiring additional expensive ingredients. Mother could feed 12 people with 6 potatoes and a handful of flour, marveled Eleanor, whose parents took in relatives who lost their farm during the Depression. She'd make potato soup with rivels, and somehow everyone would leave the table satisfied. It wasn't just the food, it was her confidence that we'd all get through hard times together if we shared what little we had. Mock chicken legs with Meat rationed and expensive, creative cooks developed mock chicken legs, a mixture of ground pork or veal, or whatever meat was most affordable, mixed with breadcrumbs and seasonings, shaped around wooden skewers to resemble drumsticks, then breaded and fried. This transformation turned a small amount of ground meat into something that felt special, particularly for children. The presentation was key to this dish's success. Forming the meat mixture into recognizable shapes elevated it from simple patties to something that felt like a treat. The wooden skewer bone completed the illusion, allowing families to maintain food traditions even when traditional ingredients were out of reach. Father would announce chicken dinner with such ceremony, remembered Margaret with a laugh. We'd get so excited, even though we knew it wasn't really chicken. But the ritual of those mock chicken legs served on Sunday plates with such dignity, it taught us that creativity and presentation can transform even the simplest meal into an occasion. Hasty pudding. Long before the Depression, hasty pudding, cornmeal cooked with water or milk until thick, had been an American staple. During hard times, this simple dish regained popularity as an economical breakfast or dessert that required just cornmeal, water, and a pinch of salt, with molasses or maple syrup added if available for sweetness. The long cooking process transformed simple cornmeal into a creamy, filling porridge that could be adapted based on what was available. When served as a dessert, it might be poured into molds and cooled, then sliced, creating something that felt more special than its humble ingredients would suggest. Great-grandmother's diary mentions hasty pudding twice a week throughout 1932, noted historian Emily Matthews, who studies food culture. But she also records variations, adding foraged berries in summer, dried apples in winter, or simply a sprinkle of cinnamon for Sunday dinner. These small adaptations show how people maintained variety and interest in their diets even with severely limited ingredients. Vinegar pie. When fruit for pies was unavailable or unaffordable, vinegar pie offered a surprising solution. Using apple cider vinegar combined with sugar, water, and spices created a filling with a sweet tart flavor reminiscent of apples or lemons. Baked in a simple crust, it provided the comfort of pie when fruit was out of reach. This desperation pie demonstrates the scientific understanding many home cooks possessed, knowing that acid from vinegar could mimic the tartness of fruit, creating a similar flavor profile with shelf-stable ingredients. The result was a pie that satisfied the craving for something sweet at a fraction of the cost of fruit pies. I found my great-grandmother's recipe for vinegar pie handwritten on the back of a receipt from 1934. Shared culinary historian Sarah Johnson. The note beside it says, "Tastes like store-bought," which reveals just how successful these adaptations felt to families making do with what they had. Creating something that reminded them of pre-Depression treats was a victory worth recording. Homemade cottage cheese. When milk was available but other protein sources were scarce, making cottage cheese at home provided valuable protein while stretching the milk supply. By allowing milk to sour naturally, then gently heating it until the curds separated from the whey, families created a simple fresh cheese that could be eaten immediately or added to other dishes. This process transformed milk, which had a limited shelf life without refrigeration, into a protein source that could last a bit longer. The resulting cottage cheese might be eaten plain, mixed with garden vegetables, or used in casseroles to add protein and creaminess without requiring meat. My grandmother made cottage cheese every Saturday until the day she died, well into the 1980s, recalled Thomas. The process was almost meditative for her. She'd sit by the stove, carefully watching the milk, occasionally testing the curds between her fingers. She said the rhythm of those Depression-era kitchen tasks became a comfort in itself, a reminder that she had the skills to provide regardless of what was happening in the outside world. Oatmeal cookies without eggs. Cookies provided rare treats during difficult times, but traditional recipes often required eggs and large amounts of butter. Depression-era cooks developed eggless oatmeal cookies that used a small amount of fat, often lard or bacon grease rather than butter, and relied on oats for structure and substance. These cookies became lunchbox staples, providing children with energy from oats and a touch of sweetness from molasses, brown sugar, or chopped dried fruit. The recipes demonstrated how bakers understood ingredient substitutions well enough to create treats that maintained some normalcy during abnormal times. Every Monday, Grandmother made eggless oatmeal cookies for the week, remembers Doris. She'd pack 2 in my grandfather's lunch pail each day, a reminder of home during long days working on the railroad. Years later, when they could afford any cookie imaginable, he still preferred her simple oatmeal cookies. The taste of making it through, he called them. Milkless, eggless, butterless cake, perhaps the ultimate in Depression-era ingenuity. This cake used none of the ingredients normally considered essential to baking. Instead, it relied on alternative leavening, baking soda reacting with vinegar or lemon juice, and moisture from unsweetened applesauce, mashed bananas, or even pureed pumpkin. These cakes became known by various names, including war cake or depression cake, and symbolized the extreme adaptability of home cooks facing shortages of multiple ingredients simultaneously. Despite missing traditional cake ingredients, they provided the emotional comfort of serving dessert during celebrations. I found 5 variations of this cake in my grandmother's recipe box, said Melissa, an archivist working to preserve Depression-era cooking materials. Each had a different notation, good for birthdays or Christmas version. The fact that she developed specialized variations of an already adaptive recipe shows the determination to maintain celebration and specialness even in the most difficult circumstances. Foraged mushroom gravy. For rural families with knowledge of wild edibles, foraged mushrooms provided free nourishment that could transform plain potatoes or rice into something special. Mushroom gravy combined foraged fungi with the basic roux technique, creating a flavorful sauce from ingredients that cost nothing but the time spent gathering them. This practice required wisdom passed through generations about which mushrooms were safe and how to properly identify them. That knowledge became particularly valuable during the Depression, when the ability to safely supplement the pantry with foraged foods could significantly improve a family's nutrition. Grandfather would take us mushroom hunting every fall, remembered Edward, whose family lived in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. He knew exactly where to look and which varieties were safe. He'd learned from his father, who learned during the Depression when those mushrooms meant the difference between going hungry and having enough. That knowledge was as valuable an inheritance as any money could be. Lard sandwiches. At the extreme end of making do, lard sandwiches represented meals at their most basic, simply rendered pork fat spread on bread, sometimes sprinkled with salt or sugar depending on whether a savory or sweet meal was desired. While hardly nutritionally complete, these sandwiches provided calories and energy when little else was available. Some variations included a sprinkle of onion salt, pepper, or dried herbs from the garden to add flavor. Children might receive lard sprinkled with sugar as a rare sweet treat, while adults often ate the savory version to fuel long days of physical labor. My father never talked much about the hardest Depression years, said Michael, a retired steel worker. But once, watching my children complain about dinner, he quietly mentioned walking miles to school with just a lard sandwich in his pocket. And I was grateful for it, he said. That simple statement taught my children more about appreciation than any lecture could have. Sauerkraut with apples. Communities with German heritage had long traditions of preserving cabbage as sauerkraut, a practice that became especially valuable during the Depression when the ability to store vegetables through winter was crucial. To make this preserved food more appealing, especially to children, apples might be added during cooking, creating a sweet-sour dish that provided valuable vitamin C throughout winter months. This combination of sour preserved cabbage with sweet apples created a more complex flavor than either ingredient alone, making a humble preservation method feel more like a chosen dish rather than a necessity. When served with potatoes, it became a complete meal that sustained many families through cold months when fresh produce was unavailable. Every October, the women in our community would gather to make sauerkraut, recalled Heinrich, whose parents immigrated from Germany before the Depression. It wasn't just about preserving food, it was about preserving community. They would share knowledge, resources, and labor, ensuring every family had enough to last the winter. Those traditions, born of necessity, created bonds that helped everyone survive. Water dumplings. When meat for stews was unavailable, water dumplings, simple dough made from flour, water, and salt, then dropped into boiling water, provided a filling meal with minimal ingredients. These dumplings could be served simply with browned butter and salt or with gravy made from flour and broth if available. The technique created a meal from the most basic pantry ingredients when little else was available. The dumplings cooked quickly and created a satisfying texture that felt more substantial than the sum of their parts, an important psychological aspect of meals during difficult times. Grandmother would tell us stories while making water dumplings, shared Catherine, whose family history I recorded. She'd say, "These saved us during the hardest winter," forming each one with such care. Years later, I realized she was making the dumplings larger and the stories longer on nights when there was nothing else to serve with them, stretching both food and distraction to fill hungry stomachs and minds. Pressed meat sandwiches. When small scraps of different meats were available, perhaps leftovers from several meals. Creative cooks would chop them finely, mix them with a bit of gelatin if available, and press them into loaves that could be sliced for sandwiches. This technique transformed bits too small to serve as proper portions into a new meal that felt intentional rather than makeshift. The pressing technique, often done by placing the mixture in a loaf pan with a weighted plate on top in a cool place, overnight created something similar to modern luncheon meat. It allowed families to serve protein-containing sandwiches when a proper cut of meat was far beyond their budget. My grandfather would save every scrap of meat throughout the week, recalled Chef Martinez, who studies historical food preservation. Sunday night, he'd create what he called special sandwich loaf for the week's lunches. His children thought it was a luxury, never realizing it was created from bits that might otherwise have been wasted. That's the genius of Depression cooking. Necessity transformed into something children actually looked forward to eating: potato and hot dog soup. Combining two affordable ingredients, potatoes and hot dogs, created a hearty soup that provided both carbohydrates and protein in one economical pot. Diced potatoes formed the base, with sliced hot dogs adding flavor and protein, all simmered in water seasoned with whatever herbs or spices were available. This soup could be stretched further by adding more water and perhaps an extra potato when unexpected guests arrived. The hot dogs, with their strong flavor and high salt content, ensured the soup remained tasty even when diluted, making it adaptable to feeding however many gathered at the table. We never knew how many cousins might show up for dinner during those years, remembered Charlotte, whose parents kept an open door despite their own struggles. Mother would add water and another potato to the pot, adjusting seamlessly as though she'd planned for extra guests all along. That soup was like a magic potion that somehow expanded to feed whoever needed feeding, without anyone feeling they were receiving less than a full share. Apple Brown Betty. When apples were in season and affordable, Apple Brown Betty provided a simple dessert that required less sugar and fat than a traditional pie. Made by layering sliced apples with breadcrumbs tossed in a small amount of butter and sugar, then baked until tender, this dessert made use of both seasonal fruit and stale bread that might otherwise go to waste. The genius of this dessert was its ability to use small amounts of expensive ingredients, butter, and sugar, while still creating something that felt special. The breadcrumbs absorbed the apple juice during baking, creating a texture somewhat similar to cake without requiring eggs or additional flour. My great-aunt's recipe box had Apple Brown Betty written on a card so worn the corners had disappeared, said culinary historian James Peterson. Beside the recipe, she'd written, "Good enough for company," perhaps the highest praise for a Depression-era dessert. It represents the pride people took in creating hospitality even when resources were severely limited. Dandelion wine. For adults seeking rare moments of celebration during difficult times, dandelion wine offered a homemade option when store-bought alcohol was an unaffordable luxury. Made from foraged dandelion blossoms steeped with sugar, citrus, peel if available, and yeast, then fermented for weeks. This wine cost almost nothing but time and effort. The process of collecting blossoms often involved entire families, with children helping to gather the bright yellow flowers that would transform into something special for adults. The resulting wine varied widely in quality, but provided a means of marking special occasions when commercial options were out of reach. Grandfather's dandelion wine was legendary in our community, shared Reverend Thomas. He'd bring out a bottle for weddings, christenings, even funerals, moments that deserved marking despite hard times. Years later, when he could afford any store-bought wine, he still made it every spring. The taste of perseverance, he called it, a reminder that even in the bleakest landscape, something golden can be created with enough patience. Onion gravy. When meat was unavailable for flavoring gravy, onions provided a flavorful alternative. Slowly caramelized onions, cooked until deeply golden, formed the base for a gravy made with flour, water, and perhaps a bit of coffee for color and depth. This vegetarian gravy provided rich flavor for potatoes, rice, or biscuits without requiring expensive meat drippings. The slow cooking process transformed humble onions into something sweet and complex, proving that time and technique could add value to even the simplest ingredients. This gravy became a staple for meatless meals, turning plain starches into something worthy of being called dinner. "Every Wednesday was onion gravy night at our house," recalled Harold, whose father worked as a janitor after losing his banking job in 1931. Mother would start the onions cooking hours before dinner, filling the house with an aroma that made you forget we were having potatoes again. That sense of anticipation she created was as nourishing as the food itself. Hope served on a plate. Suet pudding. When butter was too expensive but butchers would give away suet, the hard fat around animal kidneys, resourceful cooks created steamed puddings that utilized this free ingredient. Suet pudding combined flour, spices, molasses, dried fruit if available, and grated suet, all wrapped in cloth and steamed for hours until set. The resulting pudding was dense, moist, and rich-tasting despite containing no expensive butter or eggs. Often served with a sweet sauce made from brown sugar and water, it became a special occasion dessert that cost little but offered the comfort of traditional steamed puddings. Great-grandmother's sweet pudding recipe has a note: Christmas, 1932-1939. In the margin, shared Elizabeth, who preserves her family's recipe collection. 7 consecutive Depression Christmases featured this pudding, making it as much a tradition as any elaborate cake might have been in better times. It reminds me that traditions aren't about expense. They're about consistency and the comfort of the familiar when everything else is uncertain. Bread soup. The ultimate in waste-not cooking, bread soup transformed stale bread, which no family could afford to throw away, into a meal. Dried bread cubes would be simmered in water seasoned with herbs, a bit of fat if available, and perhaps an onion until the bread broke down into a thick porridge-like consistency. Regional variations existed throughout America, influenced by different immigrant traditions, some similar to Italian ribollita or Portuguese accorda. The common thread was resourcefulness, creating something warming and filling from bread too stale to eat in its original form. "My Sicilian grandmother made bread soup until her dying day," recalled Anthony. "She'd shake her head at anyone who threw away bread, saying, 'You never lived through hungry times.' For her, this simple soup wasn't just food, it was a reminder of survival, of the wisdom that allowed her family to weather the Depression when so many others didn't make it through." Peanut butter bread. When yeast was expensive or unavailable, peanut butter bread provided an alternative that required only baking powder as leavening. This quick bread combined flour, baking powder, salt, sugar, milk, and peanut butter into a batter that baked into a hearty, protein-rich loaf without the need for eggs or butter. The resulting bread had a distinctive flavor and dense texture that made it filling and satisfying. It could be served with jam for breakfast, alongside soups for dinner, or even with a drizzle of honey as a simple dessert. The versatility of a single recipe made it particularly valuable during times when ingredients and cooking fuel were both limited resources. "I found this recipe in my great-aunt's cookbook, dated 1932, said food historian Margaret Lewis. Beside it, she'd written, "Better than store-bought, high praise during a time when homemade was often the only option, not a choice." It shows how people recalibrated their expectations while maintaining standards and finding pride in their adaptations rather than viewing them as compromises. Fish head soup. Nothing exemplified the waste-not philosophy better than fish head soup. When a family was fortunate enough to catch fish or purchase inexpensive fish, the heads, often discarded today, became the base for a nutritious soup. Simmered with vegetables and herbs, fish heads released gelatin and flavor into the broth, creating a protein-rich soup from what might otherwise be thrown away. This practice crossed cultural boundaries, with variations appearing in communities from Scandinavian immigrants to African American coastal communities. The common thread was recognizing the value in parts others might discard, a crucial skill during times when nothing could be wasted. My grandfather was known for his fish head soup, shared Maria, whose family fished the Great Lakes. He'd trade with neighbors, some vegetables for a few fish heads, creating a network of shared resources. Everyone knew which parts of the fish each family preferred, ensuring nothing went unused. This community approach to food meant everyone ate better than they would have in isolation. Liver and onions. Organ meats were significantly cheaper than muscle meats during the Depression, making liver a common protein source for families on tight budgets. Liver and onions, typically beef or pork liver sliced thin and fried with plenty of onions to balance the strong flavor, became a regular meal in many households. Rich in iron and vitamins, liver provided exceptional nutrition at a fraction of the cost of steaks or roasts. The abundance of onions helped make the strong flavor more palatable, particularly for children who might resist this economical protein source. Thursday was Liver Day, remembered Robert with a grimace that softened into a smile. We'd complain, but Mother would say, "It puts color in your cheeks." She wasn't wrong. We stayed healthy when many children showed signs of malnutrition. Years later, I learned she would only take a tiny portion herself, claiming she wasn't hungry, ensuring her children got the lion's share of this affordable protein. Potato fudge. When chocolate was an unaffordable luxury, creative cooks developed fudge made with mashed potatoes as the base. The bland, starchy nature of potatoes allowed them to absorb flavors while providing bulk and texture to this sweet treat. Combined with powdered sugar, cocoa if available, or even coffee for color and flavor, and vanilla, potato fudge satisfied the craving for something sweet when traditional candies were out of reach. This ingenious recipe transformed a humble staple crop into something that felt special, allowing families to maintain the tradition of occasional treats despite severe budget constraints. The potatoes provided body while requiring less sugar than traditional fudge recipes, making even this sweet treat more economical. Grandmother's potato fudge was our birthday tradition, recalled Susan. She'd serve it on her good china with such ceremony that we felt like royalty. It wasn't until I was grown and found her recipe that I realized she'd created something magical from the humblest ingredients. That's love, turning potatoes into a celebration when there's nothing else available. Poor man's lobster. Fresh seafood was an impossible luxury for most families during the Depression, but resourceful cooks created poor man's lobster, using firm white fish, typically cod or halibut. The fish would be cut into chunks, boiled in salted water with a bay leaf, then served with melted butter or margarine and lemon if available. This preparation method altered the texture of the fish, making it firmer and sweeter, with a surprising resemblance to more expensive lobster. The simple cooking technique elevated an affordable protein to something that felt special, maintaining the experience of seafood meals on a fraction of the budget. Father would announce lobster dinner with such flourish, laughed Eleanor, whose family lived on the Massachusetts coast. Mother would play along, setting the table with extra care. The ritual transformed simple cod into an occasion. We felt wealthy in experience, if not in fact. That's a lesson I've carried through life. Circumstances don't define your experience nearly as much as your approach to them. Applesauce cake. When butter and eggs were scarce, applesauce provided moisture and binding for simple cakes. Applesauce cake combined applesauce with flour, sugar, spices, and minimal fat, creating a moist, flavorful dessert that required fewer expensive ingredients than traditional cakes. This economical cake became a staple for birthdays and special occasions, offering a sweet treat that felt celebratory despite its humble ingredients. Often spiced with cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves, the cake's flavor complexity belied its simple recipe, proving that celebration was possible even in the leanest times. In my mother's recipe box, her applesauce cake card is stained and worn thin from use, noted James. Beside the recipe, she'd written all our birthdays with check marks for each year. Even in the worst years, 1933, 1934, every birthday has a mark, a record of her determination that economic hardship wouldn't rob her children of marking special days with something sweet. Milk toast with peanut butter. Simple milk toast. Bread soaked in warm milk gained additional nutrition when a small amount of peanut butter was stirred into the milk. This adaptation added protein and calories to an already comforting dish, making it more substantial while still using readily available ingredients. For children, this dish provided essential nutrition in a form that was both comforting and easy to eat. The warm milk softened the bread completely, while the peanut butter added flavor and protein that might otherwise be missing from restricted diets. My father remembered peanut butter milk toast as his favorite childhood meal, shared Professor Williams, who studies Depression-era nutrition. His mother served it on cold mornings before school, calling it brain power breakfast. Only as an adult did he realize it was one of the few protein sources they could afford, her way of sending him to school with enough energy to learn despite their circumstances. Cornmeal scrapple. Pennsylvania Dutch communities had long made scrapple from pork scraps and cornmeal, but during the Depression, the recipe adapted to use far less meat, sometimes none at all. Cornmeal would be cooked with broth, often made from bones or meat scraps, formed into a loaf, then sliced and fried for breakfast. This adaptation maintained the tradition and experience of scrapple while requiring far less meat than traditional recipes. The crispy exterior and soft interior provided textural interest to meals that were often limited in variety, making simple ingredients feel more special. Grandfather was a butcher before the Depression, recalled John from Lancaster County. When his shop closed, he kept making scrapple at home, but with less and less meat as times got harder. He'd say, "The technique matters more than the ingredients." He was right. His cornmeal scrapple, fried crisp in a cast-iron skillet, still felt like abundance even when it contained almost no meat at all. Bean sprout sandwiches. When fresh, vegetables were scarce or prohibitively expensive, many families sprouted beans at home, a process that required only dried beans, water, and time. These homegrown sprouts would be placed between bread slices, perhaps with a smear of mayonnaise or butter if available, creating a sandwich with vegetable nutrition during seasons when garden produce was unavailable. This practice of sprouting transformed inexpensive dried beans into fresh, vitamin-rich greens with no garden space required, just a jar and some water. The crisp texture of the sprouts created interest in otherwise plain sandwiches, providing both nutrition and variety when both were hard to come by. My grandmother kept mason jars of sprouting beans on her windowsill all winter, remembered gardener Mary Johnson. She'd learned during the Depression that you didn't need land to grow fresh food. Those sprouts provided something green and fresh when nothing was growing outside. She maintained this practice her entire life, saying, "Growing your own food, even on a windowsill, is the ultimate independence." Pickle sandwich. When meat for sandwiches was unavailable, pickle sandwiches provided flavor and crunch between bread slices. Home canned pickles from summer cucumbers brought tanginess and texture to winter meals, providing variety when fresh vegetables were out of season or unaffordable. Sometimes enhanced with a thin spread of mayonnaise or mustard if available, these sandwiches made the most of home-preserved garden produce. The vinegar tang stimulated the appetite, making simple bread seem more satisfying than it might otherwise be. Mother's pickle sandwiches were famous in the school lunchroom, chuckled George. Other kids would trade almost anything for them, although they had little to trade. The secret was her sweet sour bread and butter pickles, thinly sliced and perfectly seasoned. Years later, I realized those sandwiches contained nothing but bread and homemade pickles, yet they were so good, other children envied them. That's the art of making poverty invisible through skill. Boiled dinner. A single pot meal that stretched. A small amount of meat with abundant vegetables, boiled dinner became a staple across America during the Depression. Typically made with a small piece of salt pork, ham hock, or corned beef simmered with potatoes, cabbage, carrots, and onions, this one-pot meal required minimal attention once assembled. The long, slow cooking process allowed the flavors to meld, while tenderizing even the toughest, most economical cuts of meat. The resulting meal provided a complete protein-vegetable combination in a format that could be started before leaving for work and be ready upon return. Sunday's boiled dinner became Monday's hash, Tuesday's soup, and and Wednesday's potato cakes, explained culinary historian James Mitchell. This cascade of meals from one cooking session demonstrates the efficiency that became essential during the Depression. Nothing was cooked just once. Each preparation laid the groundwork for subsequent meals, conserving both food resources and precious cooking fuel. Noodles and cottage cheese. Eastern European immigrant communities introduced this simple combination that became widely adopted during the Depression. Egg noodles tossed with homemade cottage cheese and perhaps a bit of butter or sour cream. If available, created a satisfying meal with both carbohydrates and protein. The soft, creamy texture of the cottage cheese coated the noodles, creating a dish somewhat similar to mac and cheese but requiring no sauce-making technique. Often sprinkled with black pepper or paprika for additional flavor, this humble combination provided substantial nutrition at minimal cost. Friday was always noodles and cottage cheese, remembered Rachel, whose Hungarian grandparents brought this tradition to America. It wasn't just economical, it was a connection to their homeland. During the Depression, maintaining cultural traditions provided comfort beyond the physical nourishment of the food itself. Those noodles represented resilience, both personal and cultural, during times when everything familiar seemed threatened. Poor man's cake, also called war cake, from its origins in World War I, poor man's cake used no eggs, milk, or butter, ingredients that were either rationed or too expensive during hard times. Instead, it relied on dried fruits for sweetness and moisture, with spices adding flavor complexity that belied its simple ingredient list. These cakes could be made with minimal sugar by using dried fruits like raisins, prunes, or dates for natural sweetness. Often mixed by hand in a single bowl, they required little equipment and minimal cleanup, important considerations when both time and resources were limited. "This cake appears at every family reunion," said Marion, holding a handwritten recipe card. Great-grandmother noted beside it, "Christmas 1934. Still good." That simple statement says so much about maintaining standards and finding joy in difficult circumstances. We make it not because we need to save eggs or butter now, but to remember her resourcefulness and determination to create celebration despite hardship. Spam hash. When Spam was introduced in 1937, it quickly became popular for its affordability, long shelf life, and versatility. Spam hash, diced Spam, fried with potatoes and onions, stretched this affordable meat product into a complete meal that could feed a family for relatively little cost. The salty, distinctive flavor of Spam permeated the potatoes, creating a satisfying one-pan meal that required no refrigeration for the meat component. Sometimes topped with a fried egg if eggs were available, this hash provided protein and filling carbohydrates in an easy-to-prepare format. "Father worked for the railroad," shared Thomas. "During his travels, he'd sometimes bring home a can of Spam. A relatively new product then. Mother would transform it into hash that seemed to multiply on our plates." Years later, she admitted she would dice the Spam very small and increase the potatoes when money was particularly tight, creating the illusion of abundance when reality was quite different. Fried corn mush with syrup. Leftover cornmeal mush, cooled overnight and sliced, transformed into a completely different meal when fried until crisp and served with syrup or molasses. This technique turned a basic staple into something that felt like a treat, providing variety without requiring additional ingredients. The contrast between the crispy exterior and soft interior created textural interest, while the sweet topping made it feel like a special breakfast rather than a necessity. Born of limited options, this two-stage preparation demonstrated the creativity cooks employed to prevent meal fatigue with limited ingredients. Grandpa would request fried mush with blackstrap molasses even decades after the Depression ended, recalled Pastor Johnson. He said it reminded him that hardship could be temporary. They'd eat soft mush when times were leanest, but being able to save some overnight to fry the next morning meant things were improving. For him, that crispy edge represented hope, a powerful association that stayed with him his entire life. Tomato gravy. When meat for traditional gravies was unavailable, tomato gravy provided a flavorful alternative to pour over biscuits, potatoes, or rice. Made by creating a roux with flour and fat, then adding canned tomatoes or tomato juice instead of milk or meat broth. This bright, tangy gravy added interest to plain, staple foods, often seasoned with black pepper, a bit of sugar to balance acidity, and whatever herbs were available. Tomato gravy brought color and vitamin C to meals that might otherwise be nutritionally incomplete. For families who grew and canned their own tomatoes, this preparation stretched their garden harvest throughout winter months. Sunday morning was always biscuits with tomato gravy, remembered Jean from Tennessee. Mother made it from tomatoes she'd canned the previous summer. The kitchen would fill with this bright, tangy aroma that made even plain biscuits seem special. She could have made white gravy with just flour and milk, but that splash of red made breakfast feel abundant rather than austere. Appearance mattered almost as much as taste. Coffee soup, a European tradition that found new relevance during the Depression. Coffee soup was simply stale bread soaked in sweetened coffee, sometimes with a sprinkle of cinnamon if available. This simple combination transformed otherwise unpalatable stale bread into a sweet breakfast or dessert using coffee that might already be brewed. This thrifty dessert required no additional cooking fuel and made use of every bread heel and coffee. Drop. The sweet, soft result provided calories and comfort when little else was available, demonstrating how immigrant traditions offered solutions during universal hardship. Great-grandfather would dip his bread in coffee every morning, said Michael with a smile. When I was young, I thought it was just an old man's habit. Later, I learned it was how he'd survived the Depression. That simple combination of coffee and bread had been breakfast for years when nothing else was available. What began as necessity became ritual, connecting him daily to the resilience that had carried him through the hardest times. Creamed chipped beef, thinly sliced, dried. Beef in white sauce became a staple during the Depression and subsequent wartime rationing. The dried beef had a long shelf life, requiring no refrigeration, while the white sauce, made from flour, fat, and milk, stretched a small amount of meat into a meal that could feed a family when served over toast, potatoes, or biscuits. This dish gained the nickname SOS, same old stuff or a more colorful military variation, during military service, but was adopted by civilian families as an economical protein source. The salty beef provided flavor throughout the creamy sauce, making a little meat seem like much more. Mother made creamed chipped beef every payday, recalled Henry, whose father worked in the Pennsylvania coal mines. That first night after payday was the only time we saw meat all week, but she'd create this creamy dish that somehow felt abundant. She served it with such pride on her best plates, teaching us that presentation transformed even the simplest meals into something dignified. Potato cakes. Leftover mashed potatoes found new life as potato cakes, mixed with a small amount of flour and perhaps an egg if available, then formed into patties and fried until golden. This transformation turned leftovers into something that felt new and special, preventing the monotony that might come from limited ingredients. Often seasoned with onion, salt, and pepper, these crispy cakes provided a different texture and presentation from the original mashed potatoes. When served with a bit of applesauce or sour cream if available, they became a meal centerpiece rather than merely repurposed leftovers. Grandmother never called them leftover potato cakes, noted Sarah. She had names for each variation: golden discs when made plain, garden medallions when she added finely chopped vegetables from her victory garden. By refusing to use language of scarcity or reuse, she maintained our sense that we were enjoying something special rather than just stretching resources out of necessity. Berry grunt. When fresh berries were available from foraging or backyard plants, berry grunt provided a simple dessert that required minimal sugar and no eggs or butter. Berries would be stewed with a small amount of sugar, then topped with simple dumplings made from flour, baking powder, salt, and water, then steamed covered until the dumplings were cooked through. This dessert, sometimes called slump, required no oven, an important consideration when cooking fuel was expensive or when summer heat made oven use impractical. Using foraged berries meant this sweet treat could be created with minimal purchased ingredients, bringing a touch of luxury to otherwise plain meals. My mother learned to identify every edible edible berry within walking distance of our home," shared Eleanor, who grew up in rural Maine. Blackberries, blueberries, raspberries, even the wild strawberries that grew along the railroad tracks. When she made Berry grunt, we felt rich regardless of what else we lacked. She'd say, "Nature's pantry is always open to those who know where to look." Root vegetable fritters. Root vegetables, carrots, turnips, parsnips, and beets, stored well through winter and were often the only vegetables available during cold months. Grated and mixed with a small amount of flour and perhaps an egg, these vegetables became fritters that provided variety when fresh produce was scarce. The grated vegetables would be formed into patties and fried until crisp, creating a hot vegetable dish during seasons when salads and fresh greens were unavailable. The natural sweetness of root vegetables became more pronounced through this cooking method, making them more appealing, particularly to children. Tuesday was always fritter night, remembered Thomas. Mother would grate whatever root vegetables remained in the cellar, binding them with a little flour and water. She had this gift for seasoning, a pinch of this, a sprinkle of that, transforming humble roots into something we actually looked forward to eating. When I complain about cooking dinner now, I remember her creating meals from nearly nothing, night after night, year after year. Foraged greens with vinegar. When garden vegetables were between seasons or unaffordable, many families turned to foraged greens, dandelion, lamb's quarters, purslane, and other wild edibles that grew abundantly but were often overlooked. These nutritious greens would be washed carefully, then dressed simply with vinegar and perhaps a bit of bacon grease or oil if available. This practice provided crucial vitamins and minerals during seasons when cultivated vegetables were unavailable. Knowledge of which plants were edible, where to find them, and how to prepare them became essential survival skills passed between generations. Grandmother could identify more wild greens than I can name cultivated vegetables, marveled botanist Dr. Martin. Her knowledge came from necessity. During the Depression, these free foods kept her family nourished when their garden was between harvests. She taught me to see food where others saw weeds, a perspective that fundamentally shaped my understanding of both plants and resilience. Mock Southern biscuits. When lard or butter for traditional biscuits was unavailable, mock Southern biscuits used mayonnaise as the fat component. This substitution created tender biscuits with ingredients that might be more accessible during times when dairy products were limited or too expensive. These biscuits maintained the tradition and comfort of fresh-baked bread when traditional recipes were out of reach. The vinegar and mayonnaise interacted with the baking powder to create a light texture, while the oil provided the necessary fat for tenderness, an example of understanding ingredient functions well enough to create successful substitutions. Great-grandmother's recipe box has 3 different biscuit recipes, noted culinary historian Patricia Williams. Traditional buttermilk biscuits are labeled Sunday Best, while mayonnaise biscuits are marked Every Day. The third, made with just flour and water, is simply labeled Hard Times. This progression shows how she adapted treasured recipes to match available resources while maintaining the tradition of fresh bread regardless of circumstances. Bread pudding with vanilla sauce. Stale bread transformed into dessert when soaked in a simple custard of milk, sugar, and perhaps an egg if available, then baked until set. The resulting bread pudding, while humble, provided a sweet comfort that helped maintain morale during difficult times. Often enhanced with cinnamon, raisins, or dried apples if available, this dessert stretched ingredients that might otherwise go to waste. The vanilla sauce, made from water, sugar, a bit of flour for thickening, and vanilla extract, elevated this simple dessert to something that felt special. Served warm, the sauce would soak into the bread pudding, creating a sweet, comforting treat despite limited ingredients. Sunday dinner always ended with bread pudding, recalled Minister Johnson. Mother would collect bread scraps all week, storing them in a paper bag until Sunday. No matter how lean the meal before it, that warm pudding with vanilla sauce convinced us we weren't poor at all. It wasn't just sustenance, it was dignity served on a plate, the determination that family meals would end with sweetness regardless of circumstances. Oatmeal with peanut butter. Basic oatmeal gained protein and and staying power when a spoonful of peanut butter was stirred in while cooking. This simple addition transformed plain oats into a more complete breakfast that provided lasting energy for school or work. The peanut butter melted into the hot cereal, flavoring it completely while adding valuable protein and fat. This adaptation acknowledged the nutritional limitations of oats alone, while finding an economical way to enhance their value. For children walking miles to school or adults facing long days of physical labor, this higher protein breakfast made a significant difference in energy and endurance. Father insisted on peanut butter in our oatmeal every morning, remembered Charles, whose father worked as a steelworker during the Depression. He'd say, "It'll stick to your ribs till lunchtime." He was right. That simple addition kept hunger at bay during long school mornings. Years later, I learned he often skipped lunch himself, making that hearty breakfast even more important for his children. Eggless mayonnaise. When eggs were scarce or needed for other purposes, homemakers created eggless mayonnaise using evaporated milk, mustard, vinegar, and oil. This spread maintained the creamy texture and tangy flavor of traditional mayonnaise while requiring no eggs, an important adaptation when preserving scarce ingredients for their highest use. This homemade condiment added moisture and flavor to sandwiches that might otherwise be quite plain. The technique demonstrated the chemical understanding many home cooks possessed, creating emulsions that mimicked traditional recipes while working around ingredient limitations. Grandmother's recipe box contains 7 different mayonnaise variations, noted food scientist Dr. Rivera, each adapted to different shortages: eggless, oil-reduced, even one using mashed potato as a partial substitute. These weren't just recipes, but scientific formulas developed through observation and experimentation. Home cooks during the Depression were food scientists by necessity, understanding ingredient functions well enough to create successful substitutions. Coffee cake from leftover coffee grounds. In perhaps the ultimate waste-not recipe, leftover coffee grounds would be rinsed, dried, and incorporated into spice cake batter, adding color, moisture, and subtle flavor while stretching flour supplies. This practice transformed what would normally be discarded into a useful ingredient, exemplifying the extreme resourcefulness of Depression-era cooking. The resulting cake had a dark color similar to chocolate cake, but with a unique flavor enhanced by cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves. For families who couldn't afford to waste even used coffee grounds, this cake represented ingenuity at its most creative. When I found this recipe in my great-grandmother's cookbook, I couldn't believe it, said historian Emily Matthews. The note beside it said, "Use when flour is low, stretches what you have." Imagine the mindset required to look at used coffee grounds and see an ingredient rather than waste. That perspective shift, from scarcity to resourcefulness, may be the most valuable Depression-era recipe of all. Baked apples. When flour for pies or cakes was scarce, baked apples provided a simple dessert that required minimal additional ingredients. Cored apples would be stuffed with a small amount of sugar, cinnamon, and perhaps crushed crackers or breadcrumbs, then baked until tender. This preparation transformed a simple fruit into something that felt like a proper dessert. For families fortunate enough to have apple trees or access to affordable apples, this dessert made the most of seasonal abundance. The natural sweetness of the apples meant less sugar was required than for many other desserts, making it economical as well as delicious. Every fall, Grandfather would carefully wrap each apple from their tree in newspaper, recalled agricultural historian David Johnson. Stored properly in their cool basement, these apples would last through winter, providing fresh fruit when nothing was growing. Sunday dinner always featured baked apples, not because they couldn't afford pie, but because this simple preparation showcased the fruit they'd grown themselves. There was pride in that self-sufficiency. Potato soup with dumplings. Basic. Potato soup gained heartiness and appeal when topped with simple dumplings made from flour, water, and salt. These dumplings, dropped by spoonfuls into the simmering soup, added texture and substance, transforming a simple soup into a complete meal. The technique required no additional cooking vessel and minimal additional ingredients while significantly enhancing the soup's filling qualities. For large families with limited resources, these dumplings effectively multiplied the soup's volume while adding a doughy element that provided satisfaction beyond what the broth alone could offer. Great-grandmother's diary mentions potato soup with dumplings twice weekly during winter months, noted family historian Robert Williams. She records how many potatoes she used used each time, fewer as winter progressed and supplies dwindled, but the number of dumplings increased proportionally. She understood intuitively how to balance available ingredients to maintain both nutrition and the feeling of fullness, a critical skill when resources diminished but needs remained constant. Molasses cookies. When sugar was rationed or too expensive, molasses provided sweetness for simple cookies that required minimal additional ingredients. Molasses cookies combined flour, a small amount of fat, molasses, and warm spices into a chewy, flavorful treat that felt special despite containing no eggs and little sugar. These cookies became lunchbox staples and after-school treats that maintained a sense of normalcy for children during abnormal times. The distinctive flavor of molasses, rich and slightly bitter, meant these cookies satisfied the craving for sweetness with less refined sugar than other recipes might require. My mother baked molasses cookies every Saturday until she passed, at 93, shared Eleanor with a smile. Her mother had baked them throughout the Depression, somehow finding ingredients even in the leanest times. The ritual of those cookies, their spicy aroma filling the house, the anticipation as they cooled, provided continuity through decades of both hardship and prosperity. Sometimes the most enduring family traditions emerge from the most difficult circumstances. These 100 meals remind us that human ingenuity shines brightest when faced with the greatest challenges. Our grandparents didn't just survive the Great Depression. They created a legacy of resourcefulness, waste reduction, and creativity in the kitchen that becomes increasingly relevant in our modern world. When we honor these humble recipes, we're not just remembering meals. We're celebrating the resilience of those who came before us. They transformed necessity into virtue, scarcity into creativity, and simple ingredients into expressions of care and love. Perhaps there's no greater legacy they could have left us. Next time you find yourself with leftovers to transform, or ingredients that need stretching, remember these Depression-era meals. The wisdom they contain, making much from little, wasting nothing, finding creativity within constraints, remains as valuable today as it was nearly a century ago. If you've enjoyed this journey through our culinary past, please like and subscribe for more stories of how food connects us across generations. What Depression-era meals do you remember from your family? Share your memories in the comments below.